Greetings, my dear siblings in Sowell. Honor on all of your cows. Today we will be exploring Indo-European deity reconstruction through etymology and comparative myth. If you would like to learn more about them through history and geography, you can go and check out Sapienite's channel, and you can also see a lot more in depth about our research process, how we use the Miro, and what our method of reconstruction is over there. So this is obviously all speculative, right? We have no way without any kind of written record. Obviously none of us were there. This is completely speculation on our part, but this version that I'm about to tell you differs pretty greatly from Dumézil and other of his ilk because it is done by practicing pagans, not colonial hobbyists and grave robbers. So the purpose of this activity is to potentially be for actual use. So my primary source is this little guy. This was required reading when I was working on my Druid dedicant program in ADF many moons ago. I thought this was the most boring brick that I had ever laid hands on. I hated it. And that's something coming from somebody who took 4 years of Latin. But now, all this time later, we're older, maybe wiser, and I was really pleasantly surprised when I picked it back up again and thought to start working on this project. In our quest to try to understand the differences between our Neolithic constructions of cultures such as Pelasgian and Pannonian and so on, and these Indo-European invaders, it has demanded some of the most interesting questions in the work that we've done about how different landscapes shape the values and priorities of the cultures that inhabit them, the prevalence of certain motifs, the mobility of language, and the incredible longevity of some of the themes and founding concepts, even with an influx of a new population. So I will introduce these speculative Proto-Indo-European root deities, and if you find this research interesting, you can purchase the full chart or check out our very opulent agora, including this beautiful candle series, which was inspired by traditional votive offerings from cultures around the world. So we rely on the patronage and support of viewers like you. Do all the nice clicky bell likey things, please. I really would appreciate it. So without further ado, one thing that's really interesting in studying these more primitive or root kind of versions versus later cosmology that includes fleshed out cultic versions, like in the case of the Phanes myth with the egg and the cosmic order laid out in that way, or the contrast of the primordials, which split the darkness from the light. We have in this version Mother Night, which is almost more akin to something like the Aboriginal Dreamtime, where there is kind of a dream or a template of divinity that is dreamed up before in, the great night and sleep, before it comes to actual form in the world. This version of the Night Mother really emphasizes concealment and gestation and this period of darkness that occurs in the womb prior to coming into being. And there is seemingly kind of an understanding that deities undergo this as well and have this kind of gestation. And so if that's kind of the primordial chaos, albeit not like swirling or destructive, there is this counterforce in Arthas, who is the god of cosmic order, and we see in the root of his name and his potential consort, Hartkaya, or Artkaya, the bear mistress, this correlation to potentially the Big Dipper constellation, which throughout a lot of the Asiatic world and also in Europe, this North Star is a guiding, orderly force that, of course, our whole world orients around, and this makes sense for a wandering culture that relied upon the stars for navigation. So, of course, proving any kind of actual familial relation or consorthood is very difficult. I tend to do it a lot more liberally than Sapienite does for the purpose of organization, and I find the connections meaningful, and I feel some of them are fairly safe to make. One that is particularly noted and interesting about Hartkaya is that she is specifically a stepmother to the the great hero, and kind of a mentor and a teacher of him. And so we see this a lot in the ancient world of the bear as a mentor, caretaker, and protector. And in this case, we see the feminine form in Mother Bear. She's also associated with mountains and wilderness in general, and of course all of the wild animals, so she has a little bit of that Artemis kind of connotation as well. Apo Mater is, of course, the mother of waters. You're going to start to see that pretty frequently. Mater is the honorific title, of course, for a great mother of some type. She is specifically the freshwater or purification, and there is evidence of both a salt and freshwater feminine primordial in Indo-European. Her son is Hepam-Nepots, which is believed to be the base for Neptunus, and he is the nephew of the water, and in a lot of the reconstructions they paint him as kind of a bringer of vengeance or restorer of a rightful line, or this kind of involved heroic figure. I'm not completely sold on that whole idea, but in any case he is the strongest form we have of a type of masculine sea deity. Maria is the sea mother, the saltwater primordial ocean, who is associated with abundance but also danger, because of course the Indo-Europeans were a more land-oriented people and the ocean was quite foreboding. This is where we get Maria, Mare, roots from, and she, as far as I could tell, is not monstrous herself, not necessarily like we think of Tiamat, but she is the creator of the primordial serpents, Oguis and Nagi, who seem to be at least two distinct ones, one with three heads, one that's regular, but they carry very similar connotation, which is that they are hoarders of water and obstructors of the natural order and kind of parasitic. And specifically to the Indo-Europeans, they were stealers of cattle. This was the dragon that needed to be slayed. Angnis, or Agnis, is the sacred fire god, the flame that sacrifices are made to, and he is also a messenger and kind of an embodiment of a living flame. That is where we get Agni in Vedic. Vesta seems to be on something of a grandmother sort of primordial level as a hearth goddess, keeper of the domestic fire, and provider of hospitality and a communal center, of course again containing the fire to which sacrifices must be made. And in my thinking she would be something of a consort or counterpart to Colnus, who is the smith god, and we see this smith god at different levels of antiquity in the surrounding cultures. Sometimes the smith god precedes the forging of the sun and the moon, for example, like we see in Baltic. Sometimes it's kind of a later thing, as we see in Slavic. But in any case, Colnus is the theoretical smith god who handles the making of weapons and armor and is responsible for metallic or transformative craftsmanship. Of course, bronze smithing, very, very important to the Indo-European people. Myrta is the goddess of death, right, and mortality, where we get these words from. There is also a version, Collio, who is the goddess of burial and covering, specifically with earth. In this case, I am conflating them. That is an intentional choice that I've made, but there is a possibility that she belongs to something of a trinity with the fortune goddess and the birth goddess, as we see in several other Indo-European derived pantheons, where you have a trinity of the fates or the spinners who control the thread of life. So it is possible she is part of a tripartite situation. It is also possible that she has something more of a counterpart, which is like a life goddess, who is the Sewa, which is the root that we get the word Eve. And this is the vital living goddess, something of a Shakti force in the world that is like more of a bright and airy breath of life thing, as we see in the Vedic tradition. She's the source of generational continuity. It is not evident whether this is like a founding Eve first woman situation in the Indo-European, and we'll talk about that whole thing later on, but she is at the very least a potential concept for the life force itself. This one is my reconstruction, is Woksa, who is the living word. We have evidence that in all of these Indo-European based cultures, there is a strong emphasis on the bardic tradition, on incantation and keeping of stories through oral tradition, being not only a cultural imperative, but a magical tradition and having the possibility of transforming the world around them. There are many heroic bard type figures, and so this is a speculation about the possibility of Woksa, who is akin to something like a Gnostic Sophia, right, who is the feminine order and the naming of things. So it's possible that she would have a pair of twins. One is a fairly strong concept, which is Midor, the healer or the wise measurer, and his name is also cognate with Moon, which we'll look at a bit later. But he is a measurer and decider of the right proportion, and that in turn comes to have to do with healing and dispensation of medicine. And it's possible he has this brother, Herbru or Wekwan, and that would be more of the active champion of the word, who would be like Ogma, who would be, traveling around with his club. He's the sacred bard, the teller of the tales, Taliesin and such, maybe something of a bard warrior, and also a speaker of the law, perhaps enforcer. And Sapionite actually speculated about the connection to this trifold concept that he's explored in several videos that have to do with like the Nordic tradition, with Loki and Lothar and all of that. So we have Wihan, Wilio, and Wodu, related of course to Odin, which are upholders of this sacred oath and law in their various ways, and the divine madness also. So now we come to the crowd favorite, Skydad, of course, Deus Pater. This is, of course, considered to be the main deity of the Indo-Europeans and kind of their native concept that was then spread to the Neolithic cultures, this emphasis on the sky. And Deus Pater is very specifically the daytime sky, and there's speculation that there were kind of three heavens. There was the white sky, which is Deus Pater, there is Nox, the black sky, and then dawn being the red sky, and there were these phases, and that they had different rulership of different things. But Deus Pater is, of course, the king of sovereignty and laws and oaths and order. It could be thought of as an emanation of Artus, as the cosmic space kind of Uranus order, and this is more like Zeus. So, of course, there's this pervasive belief that all of these different versions of the center of the pantheon, Skydad, is this whole deal. And his counterpart is Earth Mother, of course, Degam Mater, who represents the fertile ground, the potential of material existence, and in the case of the Indo-Europeans, also burial. So it seems that their equal at that celestial level is Hausos, the dawn, not a daughter of theirs, but an equal on that level, who is a red mother, kind of, herself. She's associated with beauty and renewal in that kind of red blood menstrual way. And as I mentioned, there's this concept perhaps of this red sky, both the evening and the dawn, being this kind of change or this transition. And so she's not so much the pretty Venus Valley girl perhaps that like Aphrodite would be. She is kind of powerful force in her own right for transformation. So it's possible that this is where we see the introduction of the Cupid kind of concept, which is her son or helper Austros, the morning star Venus. He's a light bringer, a messenger of love and celestial guide, and perhaps also a kind of wayward lover himself, with misplaced affection. So the evidence that I could find, at least on the first wave, and of course Indo-Europeans migrated over several different periods. It wasn't just all in one go. But at the beginning, at the very least, we have this very important named character who is Saul, the sun goddess, and this feminine sun that we then see in Baltic as Saule is very well preserved. but she is the all-seeing eye, the watcher, and she is a traveler and the celestial charioteer. So this is probably through the Indo-Europeans where we get the Apollo sun chariot across the sky situation introduced. And there is evidence that later on there was more of a masculine solar deity. I was not able to uncover a proper name for him or really strong evidence for what that would be, but it does start to be a more masculine representation as the warrior culture is embraced more and more and more, and they start putting suns on everything, and it seems to be that evolved. But for our purposes, it is a sun goddess, and she has a resulting child from a dream with Mother Night, who is very interesting as Dueros. And this is something of a Janus kind of figure that is the guardian of the thresholds or keeper of the hours, and he is the result of where dawn or dusk touch night, and you have this this border or passage. So he is the doorkeeper. The evidence points to the Indo-Europeans having a masculine moon god. There is also perhaps a more primal moon goddess, Diana type thing, but for our purposes we have Menot as the moon god and potential consort of the sun goddess. He is a measurer of the months, a nocturnal judge and keeper of cycles. His name comes from that same root that we talked about, which means to measure, and there's relationship, of course, with moon, menses, all of those kind of things. Perkunos you should be perhaps familiar with. This is the thunder hero, where we get Thor. This is the OG rain bringer. He's also associated with oak trees and a slayer of serpents. The Heklos Divoi are the twin sons of Skydad. They are Hexaus and Siosaus, and they are the divine horsemen that rescue the daughter of the sun. They are healers, dawn riders, and they protect travelers, especially sailors. So the daughter of the sun, the solar maiden, I could not find the proper name for her, but she is well attested in the monomyth type of story that's been preserved, and we see it in many surrounding cultures of this abducted bride who is responsible for the changing of the seasons. We see it in Persephone and Sita and the like, where her return heralds the, bringing life back to the land. So she is abducted in particular by the dragon that we talked about earlier and has to be rescued by these twin horsemen. So Emos typically is described as a giant, although it's not completely confirmed that he would be. It is very common in Indo-European and its derivatives for being a giant to kind of be associated with being primordial or being a prior nation of people, or one that was displanted or taken over. You see that in Celtic in particular with the cycles, but it's not super necessary that he's a giant. He just probably was. This is the first mortal, the first to die. So when he is killed and sacrificed, he becomes the king of the underworld, and he is betrayed and sacrificed, of course, by his twin brother, and we see this echoed in Ymir and potentially Romulus and Remus. And Manus is this killer, sacrificer, who kind of becomes the first priest. He's a progenitor of humankind. He makes this ultimate sacrifice to divide the living from the dead, basically. So he's a culture founder. And Manus should not be surprising that it's cognate with man, but also with hand, and kind of just this concept of humanity. So he's the progenitor. And then interestingly, who seems to be a very important character in their heroic cycle and kind of a main deal, is Tritos, which just means third. It's as simple as it sounds, but he's pretty cool because he is the first cowboy. He is very specifically the cattle recoverer, and we see echoes of this in many Indo-European derivative myths of cattle raids, because cattle were very important. They were the currency, they were, the wealth and the opulence, and so when the dragon steals the herd of cattle, which of course they are apt to do because they eat them, you need the hero champion. And so Trito is the warrior champion who recovers the cattle. So Hekwana, the horse goddess, is the sovereign mare, and she is kind of goddess of the land. Not that she is the land, but she's the protector of the land, if that makes sense, associated with fertility, travel, but also royal investiture. So this is the divine feminine selecting mechanism. In the case of the Indo-Europeans was, of course, the horse lady. Makes sense, horse girl, cowboy, and she picks the rightful king. So this is the potential route for Epona. And her consort is Rigos, who is the rightful king. He is the perhaps not direct child of, although could be more so an emanation or incarnation of Taos himself. This is the chosen ruler on earth, blessed by the divine horse queen. Yima is the winter crone. She's associated with mountains and therefore cold and therefore bad. She's kind of maligned and regarded to be, kind of a witch, kind of an outcast. And she represents seasonal death, but she also has an interesting side, which is she's a keeper of seed, or kind of this forcer of dormancy, which allows for the potential for new life in the spring. Although there is a period of scarcity, it is followed by renewal, and we see this really well portrayed in the Baltic myth. And if you are interested in a more storyteller format of this type of content, please check out my Baltic video where we do a full story time when we talk about the battle with Ragana and driving back the winter to bring back the spring. So Prithvi, very obvious cognate with the straight up Vedic Prithvi, which just means earth, is specifically the broad earth or the open range, which of course was very treasured and valued by the horse people who were riding all around. She can be, I think, thought of as an emanation or extension of Degam Mater. Whether you want to think of her as like a child of Sky Dad and Earth Mom, that's probably fine too. I frequently think of them as emanations or incarnations, but she is the spatial expanse. And similarly, Danu, I consider to be kind of an emanation or daughter of Appa Mater, but she is very specifically rivers. And those familiar with Celtic will notice, that's Danu, who is the mother goddess of the Tuatha. But the Indo-Europeans did not regard rivers quite so positively because it was considered to be like a boundary. It was, if you think of Oregon Trail, you don't really want to have to ford the river. It's a dangerous prospect when you've got the horses and the cattle and everything. So rivers were kind of like a hard stop boundary, and they represented territory and, kind of the sovereignty of that area. But they also could be used for migration and transport. So she's kind of more the goddess of the physical feature of the river, and that's why we see this as the root word in so many European rivers, right? The Dnieper, the Danube, very obvious cognates. Leontus is very fun etymologically. He's the blowing one. I enjoy that. He is the wind father, and he's a little bit more involved, as far as I can tell, than some of the similar like fathers of the four winds in other cultures, where they're a little bit more on that primordial level. But it does seem like he partners at least with Night Mother to have several offspring. And he is one that kind of gives life and animation through breath, which we see very prevalent in the Vedic concept of this breath of life. Not as much in other parts of Europe, but the animation through weather is very interesting. Of course, we have other storm deities and thunder deities, but wind as an active member of the pantheon is kind of fun and unique, I think, in Indo-European. Wilunos is a speculative reconstruction that we think the words for Veles or Velnius come from, and he's kind of fun because he is the underworld cowboy. He has associations both with cattle and herding, and also kind of being a psychopomp, and potentially snakes. So it's not very clear whether the Indo-Europeans had a concept of the chthonic realm as truly like underground. It seems like they might have had a little bit of flat earth thing going on despite being very widely traveled. They have a concept for the edge of the world, which is kind of like in the Fields of Elysium, promised land, afterlife type of place that's a little bit more pleasant and heavenly. But did they have necessarily a dark chthonic hell? It's not very clear. But we do have this concept of an afterlife escorter, and that is in the form of Wellunos, as well as one called Geraint, potentially, who is kind of just like old man. Not sure if that's where we get the concept for Charon from, as far as a ferryman. Boat concepts are not quite as strong. They seem to kind of like the horse thing, but we do see a couple of these characters potentially as escorters of the underworld. Texan is the divine artisan, the carpenter who creates all of the helpful handy tools. He's a builder and chariot maker, so he's a very foundational character and my personal favorite. He is the architect and the executor of the ordered form. So I saw a post the other day that was, what is it with all these chthonic deities always having these farm tools, right? You've got the scythe, you've got the pitchfork. So I think that this kind of was a potential origin of that, and we've talked a lot about, in Etruscan, this primordial fashioner or maker or director, I guess, in the form of Tages, who is both perhaps this Saturnian old man, wise guy kind of deal, but also sometimes appears as a child who has all of the wisdom of an adult. So it's not really obvious what form any of these characters take, of course, because we don't have any depictions really to count on. But I really like this character, and I, in my headcanon, have shipped him with Snatria, who is the goddess of weaving, because the root for tech also does mean to fashion, fabricate, or weave. And so weaving, of course, in ancient times was frequently done by both men and women. It's later on thought to be kind of the pastime only of women, but is associated both with, fate in the form of the three fates, but also it took so much labor. We take it for granted nowadays, but in order to create fabric, not only for clothing, but for sails, for nets, for catching animals or fish, weaving was really, really important for all utility textiles. So Snatria is a fate weaver, and perhaps the predecessor of Lima, who is overseer of birth, marriage, a matchmaker, and a keeper of mortal destiny. And she, of course, is said to sit basically atop the highest mountain, kind of where the North Star would be, and oversee human fate. Bagos is where perhaps we eventually get Bacchus from, is kind of one side of this earth deity who is the dispenser of fortune, perhaps counterpart to Fortuna or Tyche herself. And he's in charge of allotment, specifically, kind of this dividing of your share and inheritance. And potentially has a consort who is Dyla, who I learned is where we get the word like to dole out. So she is also a divider or distributor of lots, your lot in life. There's a lot of those kind of fun little words that I think we don't think about the root of too much. They're not necessarily super Latin roots. But she, of course, is like Tyche. She has to do with prosperity and potential and luck. Oitos, or perhaps Prebion, we debated quite a bit in our discussion group about these things. And there is a concept of this root as a kind of heroic level oath keeper. Obviously, we see this theme of oaths being very important in Indo-European culture, and we see it from the cosmic all the way to this potential heroic level. And it has to do with everything, because you don't have written contracts, right? The verbal contract and the spoken word is of critical importance. So being honorable and keeping your oath is really important. So sworn alliances and marriage which I looked in the fun brick. The word for marriage in Indo-European actually meant to lead one home, and I think that's really romantic and cute considering the depictions that we've always seen of these people. But this solemn course, this staying of the course and this oath, perhaps are attributed to this character who is like the good husband. So Previa, or perhaps Wena, is of course where we think we might get the concept for Venus from as goddess of love and desire. She is also a goddess of peace and social concord, perhaps related to this oitos, going of the course, upholding of bargains, and maintaining of social order through keeping of oaths. There's a version of the root that means to desire or strive for, and she is also perhaps the template for the good wife in the form of Juno. Rudlos, a little bit weaker, very speculative, but I happen to like it, so we're keeping it in. He perhaps either comes from a root meaning to rend, tear apart, or to howl, and associated with the savage wilderness. And this is perhaps the template for the horned god, who of course is very prominent in Celtic traditions. He's a protector of animals, patron of hunters, and general wild guy. The root, of course, is where we also find Rudra, who is very important in Hinduism, and is a bringer of justice and slayer of demons, and kind of this sovereign, sacred, masculine concept. And of course you see the horned one being very prominent in like a bitheistic Dianic tradition that holds him as the divine masculine counterpart to the moon goddess. We have no evidence of that this early on, but it's fun to think about. Koryonos we have conflated with Mawort, and he is the war chief and the keeper of the war band. He's associated with wolves and the covenant of martial brotherhood through military endeavors and with frontier expansion. And as I mentioned earlier, his stepmom or mentor was Artikaya the bear, who is mother of the mountain. So he was taken in and trained by her to become this great leader. And so that's another example of like the feminine selection and the rightful order of things, passing on a blessing of rightful rule, in this case for the military. How did that play into the whole invasion and expansion and pillaging situation? Maybe that's not so great, but perhaps at least in the beginning there was some sense of rightful rule and need to unify, perhaps. Yevos Mater is interesting, very removed from just the concept of Earth Mother itself, right? This is the grain mother, who we would think of as Ceres or Demeter. But Demeter is very obviously a direct cognate from Dega Mater. So where, we see later on the process of agriculture and farming being kind of central to the concept of female earthy fertility, of course, to the Indo-Europeans who were not really doing that as much, or they were kind of coming upon people who were already doing that and just kind of either trading with or taking from them. The grain mother is kind of separated from that central earth mother pillar, and she is very specifically associated with barley and beer, and then her offspring have a lot to do with mead, which the Indo-Europeans were just really incredibly into. They loved that. So from her we get Medwan and potentially Medwi, the lord and lady of mead, who have to do with poetry, feasts, that kind of Dionysian inspiration toward expression and being intoxicated and in touch with the divine. It's possible that Medwi also was more of like a bee mother and had more associations with the feminine aspects of bees. We see that in the Baltic and I believe also Finnish, that there is a prevalent bee mother. So there's a speculative son also of the grain mother, who is Granos, who is the dying grain boy, the sacrificial youth. We see that in Attis and other places, this close association of the mother with her beautiful baby boy who is sacrificed in order to continue the cycle of fertility in the harvest. And his name is derived from the root that means to grow or become ripe. Please don't take the order I've presented these in as in any indication of importance. I just tried to organize them as best as I could. Pausen is actually a very, very important deity to the Indo-Europeans. He is kind of Big Daddy Cowboy. He is the pastoral god, guardian of the herds, of travelers, of the cattle themselves. He protects lost animals and has to do with the accumulation of wealth, of course, in the form of cows. And his root comes from to protect or pasture or feed. So he is the benevolent provider, masculine god. Very interesting. We don't always see this type of earth god as much as we see Earth Mom. So he's a very cool, unique character, I think. And his consort, who is super important and crucial and central to this whole thing, is Guomater, who rules over cattle, motherhood, and of course milk, in particular the milk as the cow product that enabled the spreading of the civilization and upholding of the immense population that it required to cover this incredible expanse. And there is evidence that there was a primordial cow also similar to Adumla, who was sacrificed to create all of the animals on the earth at the time that Ymir was sacrificed also to create people. The myth seems to go something like the primordial cow was kidnapped by the dragon and had to be recovered by the hero, and so then the cow could be properly sacrificed. It just wouldn't work if we let the dragon eat her, right? We had to kill her properly and then cut her up and create the various types of animals. But for our sake, we make a very conscientious separation between the primordial cow goddess as this sacrificial Tarvos kind of thing versus Guomater, who's clearly at least partially human, so that she is participating in the motherhood aspect of perhaps birthing other deities, Equana being the most likely daughter of hers. So we have the cow giving birth perhaps to the horse or resulting in the horse. So culturally, the thing that I think is the most important takeaway and wasn't, at least to me, represented clearly enough when I was studying these things at first was that the Indo-Europeans were primarily a cow culture, and it was a case of the horses really enhancing the cow experience and being an upgrade to the cow technology, because the first chariots actually were, of course, driven by cows, not by horses, and so that was a later development. So it's interesting to see and speculate about the evolution of this culture and these deities through the eyes of horses being able to be expanded and evolving and being perfected as a technology, because there's all of these stages of horses that allowed for more and more usage, of course. Without saddles and stirrups, it's kind of difficult to ride bareback. Of course, there's evidence that they did, but without the foundational underpinning of cows as their form of currency and their way of life, and driving the cows and the travel that required, and the way that they interacted with all of the different tribes that they encountered over the course of these drives, that's where we get the complexity and all of the really interesting mixings that happen at every different place. And of course, being Celtic myself, and kind of having seen this process through the eyes of interpreting from the Druidic tradition, these Indo-European roots, it's kind of interesting to see how the Celtic people took this cowboy thing and then we're like, yeah, I think we're going to be horse girls. That's kind of more where our values lie. So interesting evolution. Let me know what you thought of this little adventure in the comments. I understand it was a little bit breakneck. I tried to give kind of more total overview. I'm happy to go more into detail if that's something that people would like. But of course, we've produced a lot more of these charts and overviews than we've had time to produce videos for. And so there's a lot that hasn't been covered. If there is a culture in particular that you would like to be featured, please be sure to let us know. We do read all of the comments and try and take that on board when we're scheduling our priorities. But if you like this and I get enough positive response on it, maybe I will take over doing at least the chart overviews, because it's been a really mixed bag in the reception as far as like creating more in-depth guides, where both the Baltic is kind of one of our top sellers of all time, and then the Druid guide never sells any. So is it like people don't want an in-depth guide? Is it the format? Is it which culture it is? It's very difficult to tell when we don't get a lot of specific feedback. So we really do value the comments, and I appreciate you spending this time with me today, and I hope you have a really great rest of the day and your pillow is cold and fluffy on both sides.